Hello, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on how business leaders are navigating extreme uncertainty in the face of COVID-19. My name is Eric Wogelmuth, and I'm the COO at Future 500, a nonprofit consultancy that builds trust between companies, advocates, investors, and philanthropists to advance business as a force for good. I am joined here virtually by the majority of our team, and members are based in Portland, Oregon, and in San Francisco, California. This webinar was first presented to our Corporate Affinity Network on March 20th, 2020, and our team has adapted the content into a publicly accessible version, which we will share with you here today. One of Future 500's critical roles is to help companies see around the corner, to anticipate and manage risk, seek opportunities to lead, and to leverage your firm's unique expertise and assets to be an essential force for good. With the emergence of COVID-19, we are now living through perhaps the most unprecedented social and economic crisis in living memory, certainly in mine. And if ever there was a time and a need for companies and advocates to lead, and for our team to support you through this crisis with insightful counsel and valuable connections, it is now. For our agenda today, our team will present a few slides that highlight what we're observing, specifically how some companies are leading and how some are not, how are different NGOs shifting their advocacy strategy, how global and local foundations are rapidly deploying resources. And we will close our slide presentation with our founder and president, Bill Shireman, outlining what our team anticipates is coming next, which will be critical. We are in the early days of this crisis, and it is important to anticipate what might be coming in the coming months and years. And without further ado, I'm now going to pass it off to my inimitable colleague, Ellen. Thank you.
Our team began monitoring corporate responses as coronavirus first disrupted global supply chains. And then as the outbreak became a pandemic, I'm sure all of our inboxes have experienced a similar deluge of headlines and announcements. Our team's been tracking the various ways corporate leaders are stepping up, and here are just a few of the many examples. So we've segmented them into two groups, and first we're looking at operational examples on this slide, especially accommodations in the workplace, transparency in communications with employees, and updates to benefits. Companies are vowing to continue paying workers who are unable to work during this time due to shutdowns. Many companies are initiating sick pay benefits for hourly workers, with some making the benefit changes permanent. We're also seeing examples of leadership, quote, sharing the pain, particularly in industries that are the hardest hit, such as multiple airline CEOs taking significant pay cuts. And then we're seeing leadership step up beyond the fence line or with a real societal focus. The examples here fall into a few common themes, with companies leveraging core competencies, building partnerships, philanthropy through funding injections or in-kind donations, and retooling operations. U-Haul is offering free storage for college students who may have to leave campus. Banks are allowing customers to defer mortgage payments. Amazon is teaming up with the Gates Foundation to deploy its own logistics expertise in distributing home testing kits. And Facebook has announced funding support for small businesses and is enabling local level coronavirus fact-checking through a grants program to community newsrooms. In some really interesting examples, companies are looking to retool their own operations to shift production into critical supplies. A perfume factory is beginning to make hand sanitizer, and other industries are figuring out how to make masks and even ventilators and other medical equipment. And I will now hand it off to Brendan.
Thanks, Ellen. A moment on what are seen as corporate blunders. Bottom line, media workers and consumers are now becoming hyper aware of real and perceived systemic gaps in the US social safety net and how that potentially puts us at greater risk. Anything that companies do that appear to reinforce systemic and societal inequality is coming under increasing scrutiny. Take Whole Foods. When CEO John Mackey reminded employees that they can donate PTO to one another, it only reminded frontline grocery workers how fragile their situation may be and what limited PTO they may have. And the tone was off, with that message coming from the CEO whose net worth is $100 million. It was only made worse when Amazon stepped in to say that policy predated Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods, and staff are now subject to Amazon's policy, lending the impression that Bezos was nixing Mackey and clamping down further. More broadly, sick leave, especially for hourly workers, is under the spotlight. You can see the New York Times op-ed here. Blunders related to sick leave include requiring a doctor's note or workers' fear of using it in practice, even if available on paper, highlighting troubling disconnects between corporate culture and corporate policy. For companies in the gig economy like Uber and Lyft, where contract workers provide the majority of services, the challenge for safety is inherent in those companies' business models. Drivers, for example, have complained that they don't feel supported by Uber. And companies that operate under a franchise model are exposed to reputational risk as well. Next slide. Some other examples seen as corporate blunders: utilities not suspending disconnections for customers who fail to pay bills. We could see something similar in the insurance industry, especially health insurance. Companies not adjusting the pace of work in those industries responding to what we might call pandemic demand. Amazon was in The Guardian over allegations such as these. And finally, downplaying the outbreak. Norwegian Cruise Lines is being sued by its investors who claim the company downplayed COVID-19 to keep sales up. As Paul Pullman just recently said, the COVID-19 crisis is an acid test for stakeholder capitalism. The outbreak heightens the reputational risks you faced before, as well as magnifies systemic problems in the American economy and social safety net. As always, there's likely more nuance with some of these examples, but the bottom line is that blunders emerge when you are not seen as going above and beyond to watch out for your worker safety and the health and well-being of your consumers. I'll pass it off to Andrea. Next slide.
Thanks, Brendan. So this is obviously creating new hurdles for activists to rely on the ground organizing, and it's forcing movements to adjust their tactics. But the overwhelming message is we're not backing down. These issues are as important as ever, and it's our job to stay the course and stay visible. And so a number of environmental campaigns, including Stop the Money Pipeline, Fridays for the Future, and the Sunrise Movement, among others, are pledging to use this opportunity to get creative. Be it online trainings, letter writing and email campaigns, or phone banking, texting, and peer-to-peer organizing. And with a lot of folks stuck inside, they're sort of seeking to tap into this innate desire to be a part of something meaningful during a difficult time. So it remains to be seen how young people who are now living on platforms like Zoom respond to these tactics. We also expect ESG investors and advocates in particular to closely watch how companies respond. BlackRock, for example, has reiterated its pledge to hold companies accountable on climate change and the way that they treat employees. And a lot of advocates are watching whether companies that talk about prioritizing stakeholders and putting purpose ahead of profit will stick to those principles in a crisis. And we could see this leading to an increased investor focus on the social side of ESG, which has been typically overshadowed by climate. So there is a sense that investors will punish companies that don't provide sick pay and benefits, for example, which is an added reputational risk to manage. And then a lot of NGOs and advocates are also stressing that equity has to be at the forefront of any response to this. So they're activating to oppose policies that they see as perpetuating injustice or environmental degradation. And we see that a lot with Greenpeace and Stand.Earth, Earthworks, demanding that the government care for people instead of bailing out the fossil fuel industry, and stressing that any economic response has to be an environmental one as well. And Democrats in Congress are also making these linkages by asking that any aid packages for industries affected by coronavirus include climate action. So there are a lot of linkages and intersections to pay attention to in the coming weeks, which would be interesting to watch. And on that note, I will pass it off to Kellen to talk about philanthropy.
Great, thanks, Andrea. For any of you who have been to any of our in-person working groups in the past, you've probably heard us harp on the role of philanthropy in driving the longer-term strategy of the advocacy community and to a lesser extent the responsible investment community as well. And so seeing what they're up to can be a bit of a bellwether as to what we can expect from other stakeholders down the line. That being said, the philanthropy community is not necessarily known for moving fast in response to prior crises. But in this case, it's proving to be the exception to the rule. We're seeing philanthropy on an international all the way down to a local scale deploy very rapidly. This list here is by no means encompassing, but you're seeing that foundations big and small are creating some sort of response fund to address COVID-19. You have some foundations that are working on the national or international level, some that are tailoring to certain elements of the COVID-19 pandemic that are more relevant to their foundation or to their business model. So the Gates Foundation looking more at vaccines and innovation in that space. National Domestic Workers Alliance, of course, focusing on supporting workers, others focusing on supporting students or restaurant workers, and then just an absolute bevy of local community foundations that are launching more locally tailored coronavirus relief efforts. And I think one of the key takeaways there is just wherever your company is based, there's likely a local foundation with whom you could be looking to partner in order to provide local relief. And we're seeing a lot of companies do that. Next slide, please. A few examples that are notable that I thought would be good to highlight. One is the Seattle Foundation, really one of the epicenters here in the United States, rapidly created this COVID-19 response fund. What's notable is that they've combined both their own foundation support with that of other local foundations, as well as major companies like Alaska Airlines, Amazon, and Boeing, which have all contributed to this fund, as well as individual donors that have accrued over $300,000 in online gifts. Silicon Valley Community Foundation is approaching this with a similar model, for collecting funds from across 10 Bay Area counties and their respective community foundations. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as I mentioned, is focused on vaccines. And as you heard earlier, they are partnering with Amazon to look at ways to help distribute at-home tests as well. So again, these notable corporate foundation partnerships. And Bloomberg is looking at both the global scale to support more at-risk countries, as well as more of a local scale, creating these hubs between country or cities and city leaders across the United States and beyond. So there's a lot of different interesting ways that foundations are deploying in a surprisingly rapid way here. A few other interesting things that I just came across last night that didn't add to the slides is looking at some foundations that are automatically extending every single grant that they've provided to an organization by a year in order to provide some short-term security to the operations of those NGOs. Wow. Similarly, they're providing a year of free Zoom conferencing so that those NGOs can take their operations more digital as opposed to where they might have had online meetings before. And they're also reducing their reporting requirements so that organizations can focus more on operations and less on having to be perfectly accountable to prior grant-making requirements. With that, I will hand it off to Bill to give a little bit more of a talk on what we think is coming around the corner.
Great, thank you, Kellen. It's important for us to recognize that we need to be responsive to what's happening today, but also to anticipate what is in the short-term future. We really have unique opportunities right now. It seems like we are out of control with the coronavirus, but in many ways we actually have more control than we typically do and more latitude to do different things. So what are some of the things that experts are telling us we can expect in the next few weeks and months? Now, we're not validating any of these projections, but we have gathered them from what we think are fairly reliable and expert sources. UCSF on medical, Moody's and the Federal Reserve on economic issues, and other experts in their different areas. First of all, economically, it looks like consumer spending could fall as much as 30% in the second quarter of this year. That is the fastest and biggest drop in history, even in the face of the Depression. So there will be potentially a major downturn there. 1 million jobs are expected to be lost in this month alone by March 31st, and there could be millions more in April and May, depending on how fast this process evolves. A lot of folks have not saved well. The average family savings in this country is $200,000, but that is an extremely misleading number because it takes account of the super rich and the super savers. The median is actually $12,000, and 20% of families have essentially zero or just days of savings, which means that about 1 in 5 families may become quite urgent, even desperate, in the days to come. At the same time, we are already seeing business bankruptcies, small businesses hurt very much here in San Francisco, in my neighborhood, in my community. I'm sitting in my own Airbnb because it's now vacant completely because of this. That's a big hit. The businesses and the employees that will be hit hardest are these that I've identified here, mostly based on Moody's: airlines, apparel, appliances, and so on. So those folks will be hurting. Meanwhile, health professionals at UCSF tell us, and it's UCSF, not UCSD here, that the virus will ebb in June because of warmer climate and then roar back in September. So we may feel that the virus is going away and then have to suffer through it once again. There will be bailouts, of, by, and for the people at the federal level. There will be corporate demons that will be identified and focused upon. But it's important for us to recognize that crisis is opportunity. And as these crises emerge at the individual, the family, the business, the state, the national, and the multinational level, everybody is going to be going through a different set of phases. During this time, it is important that we recognize that the opportunities to serve are greater than ever, and that this is an opportunity not just to protect business brand and business value, but also to engage in the highest service that your companies can engage in, the highest service. There will be plenty of opportunities to do that. We have room now for cultural innovations that will happen that we would not have been able to have before. I'm, teaching my kids at home now. Political views are changing. Business opportunities are changing. Some people are shifting toward, they want more of an authoritarian set of leadership, but millions of people are now gathering at the local level, making Alexis de Tocqueville, I'm sure, proud, for any of you who had poli-sci in college. Voluntary associations are springing up across the country to provide mutual aid, to weave back together the social safety net at the local level. There are thousands of mutual aid societies, all cataloged online now, engaging with each other on Google Docs, on Facebook, and through Nextdoor and other virtual and online sources. Next slide. Each crisis will follow a typical pattern. Now, it's not this pattern. This is a pattern that's useful for rational decision-making processes, but next slide, please. The emotional and cultural pattern that we will follow, and this is an approach that we've modified based on experts in the area of crises and how they affect us emotionally and culturally. We are going to all be in a phase at the local level, the individual level, as well as the national and global level of going through these 7 stages. We've been at the baseline, inattention and distraction, with a lot of things, including coronavirus, hovering. We've now been stimulated to recognize that coronavirus is real, and we've gone through the denial phase. Now we're in stage 3, escalation as a community, but not all as individuals. Some of us are doing just fine here, but we're worried. So some of us are in pain. Some of us are at a point of generosity right now. When the crisis is its worst is when people separate the most. At the individual level, they have no ability to connect with others, and that's why others need to connect to them. At the social level, this is the point where real competition and trauma and criminality steps up, and where heroism and selfishness both play a role. Hopefully soon, we will be at de-escalation and begin to reconnect with each other and reassess where we are, what we're doing. That leads to stabilization, where we gain a better understanding of what we've just been through, and when there's a tendency to look around and see who we can blame. All of our companies, we do not want to be in a position where at stage 6, we are among those that are to blame, because that can last for a generation. We saw that with oil and gas from a couple of crises ago, and this is an opportunity to turn that around. And then finally, stage 7 is the new normal, where we will be both stronger and more damaged. And the balance of that, greater strength from having gone through this ordeal, but traumatic, post-traumatic stress disorder at a social level as well as an individual level, these are all things for us to anticipate and prepare for, not get too lost in what's happening today, but what will happen tomorrow. Back to Eric.
Bill, that was great. Thank you very much. Appreciate all those awesome insights. A few other things for folks to think about. In terms of best practices, we're going to be tracking the kind of academic institutions and some of the advice they're giving companies. This is a recent one by MIT Sloan Management Business School. And some of this has already been touched on by the team, but really looking to target nonprofits that you can partner with in your communities where you operate, thinking about creative ways for your employees to volunteer in the community. I was speaking to one advocate the other day who's really looking for businesses to step up and actually help teach things like engineering and science to students remotely. There's a lot of companies that are very interested in that, and so you're going to see advocates really reaching out to companies to leverage the knowledge of their employees to help educate kids at this time. And when you do make announcements, be understated in how you do it. We already chatted about this, but it's really important to not toot your horn. You don't want to be perceived as trying to take advantage of the unfortunate situation. So be understated and humble. Next slide. A few other best practices, in terms of your employee engagement: be straight, be human, and be like Arne Sorensen. I don't know if anybody has seen his impassioned video that he sent out to all of his employees. It's online now. It was very, he got emotional. He, I think, is going through cancer treatment. So he commented on being bald, and he said that in the experience of Marriott, they have experienced 25% declines during prior recessions and economic challenges. But in some major markets like China, they've seen a 90% reduction in their guests coming to their hotels. So it's been a very dramatic and rapid challenge for them. But it was a very impassioned video to the employees to say what they're doing to support their employees at a time of great need. So be Arne as much as you can. And find strategic partners who can help scale solutions. The Gates Foundation and Amazon example is one that Kellen mentioned earlier. We are going to be keeping an eye out for how we can make these connections for you. So please do reach out to us when you're considering different initiatives and see if there's ways that we can help connect you to other funders and stakeholders who are trying to advance solutions. And on messaging, equity and fairness in the face of great wealth disparity is going to be key. We touched on CEO pay. Arne Sorensen is not taking any pay, for example. Those are really going to be scrutinized by the advocacy community. So I'll stop there, and really appreciate you carving out time. I know this is a very disruptive period, and we appreciate you spending the time of your day with us. So really appreciate it.
You're here.
Thank you, everyone. And I just want to thank my terrific team for a great job pulling all this together. It takes real teamwork. Every one of us has our specialties, and we all work across all these silos. So thank you to everyone on the Future 500 team.